So this biogeographical evidence, um, this is just simply meaning that when forms are related, they evolved in one location and then they spread elsewhere. This is going to hit on the theory of continental drift. And all continental drift is, it's assuming that if you guys can remember from high school, talking about the continents being in one landmass called Pangea, and then over time due to the shifting of the tectonic plates, they begin to spread out over time, right? Just exactly what the word says, continental drift, the continents drifted. And we know this because of a species of fern called Glossopteris, and this word is important, Glossopteris. That is most likely going to show up on an exam in the future. And this was what led us to believe that there was a spreading of the continents, like they drifted apart. And so this species was actually found in Antarctica. So this was just evidence that the continent wasn't always frozen, which I think is actually really cool. So this Glossopteris was found in Antarctica as well as in different locations as well. And then we're going to talk about microevolution. So when you think about evolution, you can think about it on two different scales. You can think about macroevolution, or the change of um, or the evolving of organisms throughout a large period of time, um, thousands of years, or you can think about microevolution, the smaller, subtle changes. But here's what microevolution is not. It is not within the individual. Instead, it's within the population. Evolution must be heritable. Again, that's important. Evolution must be heritable. It must be able to be passed on. So again, I'm going to use the same example. If I were to go out in the sun and I were to get a tan, if I have um, a child, that tan is not going to be passed on to my child, right? That's simply just within me. Um, Another example we have listed here is the color of a fox fur changing from brown to white in winter. And I don't necessarily know that I knew that, but again, that's not going to be passed on. That's just something happening within the individual. Then we begin to talk about two different I believe one was a physician, one was a mathematician, but Hardy and Weinberg. They begin to come up with this theory that actually was proven to be incorrect, but they said that the environment was in a stable, non evolving state. It was in genetic equilibrium, or what we now call the Hardy Weinberg equilibrium. They were saying that allele frequencies do not change over time. So, what's an allele? An allele is just a form of a gene, right? So, you have two genes coming together, they form alleles. It's just a pair. So, it's important to know that evolution is the change in allele frequencies in a population over time. That's what Hardy Weinberg was saying. They were saying that uh, essentially it was a stable, non evolving state. So, in order to assume Hardy Weinberg that nothing changes, nothing evolves, we have to assume these five different principles. We have to say there's no mutations, no genetic drift, no gene flow, there is random mating, no selection. And again, we're going to go into these individually. But so again, we'll start from the beginning. The principle of the Hardy-Weinberg equation indicates that allele frequencies, so genetic frequencies, in a gene pool will remain at equilibrium. Means they're balanced; they won't change. They're constant after one generation of random mating in a large sexually reproducing population if these five conditions are met. Um, so we'll go through these specifically. Over here is the equation that they came up with. If you want to bust out the Tylenol, go ahead. It's likely to give you a headache. If you're not going any further in the biological sciences, it's probably not going to come up again. So we won't necessarily dive into that today. However, these five principles are important. Um, so no mutation. So what's a mutation? A mutation is just an alteration in an allele. So mutations are what gives us variation within different species. It's the only form that gives us variation within species, and that's important to know. Um, so under Hardy-Weinberg assumptions, allele changes do not occur, right? And we know that that's simply not true. There are mutations. Some are advantageous, some are not. Um, Some genetic syndromes occur due to mutations. We know that. So, in cystic fibrosis, right? In cystic fibrosis, you have a point mutation that changes one of the amino acids, which winds up changing one of the sodium chloride channels. And that is what causes the thick, sticky mucus that they form. They're unable to sweat because of these sodium chloride channels. That's why they're prone to getting infections, just due to this malformation in this sodium chloride channel. So we know that that's not true. So no genetic drift. So what is genetic drift? Again, this is an important term to know and to be familiar with, as it will show up on an exam. Genetic drift is random changes, right? Random changes in allele frequencies by chance. Random changes in allele frequencies by chance. So, if a population is very large, changes in allele frequencies due to chance alone are insignificant, right? So, um, we'll go on to that in a little bit more detail later on. So, gene flow. What is gene flow? Gene flow is the sharing of alleles between two populations through interbreeding. So, um, we know there is gene flow because we know that interbreeding does occur. We know that there is migration of individuals. That would be assuming that you lived in the same village or you lived in the same town for your entire life, and there was the same genetics present in that town, and you never got outside of your town to meet someone. That would mean the same genes were present, right? We know that that's not true. People get out, people do have children throughout time, and there are migrations of birds, there's migrations of different species, so we know that genes do flow. Random mating. So, what is random mating assuming? It's assuming that there is exactly what the word says, random mating, right? We don't pick partners based on phenotypical appearance. What is a phenotype? A phenotype is the outer appearance. It's what the organism looks like. So, peacocks is a very good example of that on birds. A lot of times, females will choose their mate based on how pretty the bird's feathers are, and that's actually kind of a cool thing the way that they're programmed to do that. But random mating is assuming that it's the first person or the first organism they meet. Um, that's who they choose to mate with, and we know that's simply not true. Uh, the last point is no selection. So this is essentially certain phenotypes to reproduce and have more offsprings than other phenotypes. If selection does not occur, no phenotype is favored over another to reproduce. And again, that's kind of going back to random mating. Here I have an example that you can go through if you'd like. Here we're talking about. Here we are talking about. Let's see. So we're talking about gene flow, and we are talking about random mating occurring. Um, so for evolutionary changes, um, mutations are just genetic changes, and they're the only source of new variation in a population. Again, that's important to know. Mutations are the only things that causes new variations in a population. Random mating is not going to cause a evolutionary change, right? If no mutation occurs, we're going to continue to have the same genetics time after time. And again, it's important to know that these aren't needed. These just occur randomly, and they occur by chance. We now know that it's not as random as we thought, like carcinogens such as cigarette smoke can cause mutations and things like that. Um, some mutations are advantageous to organisms. Um, some are not. But it's, again, just to point back to this whole thing that it's random. Genetic drift. This refers to changes in allele frequencies of a gene pool due to random meeting of gametes during fertilization. This happens during meiosis, during sexual reproduction. Again, I give here the example that your book gives. The chance of death in one individual in a population of 1,000,000 will not have an appreciable effect on an allele frequency, right? Because it's only 1 in 1,000,000 versus if we lost 1 in 10 then you would have 10% of the alleles gone, right? So that makes so much sense that if you have one death, you're going to lose so much you're going to lose a tenth of your allele frequency in such a smaller population. But when we have a large population, it's not really even noticed. These are two terms to be familiar with: the founder effect and the bottleneck effect. The founder effect is exactly what it says. This occurs when a few individuals form a new colony. They found, right? Founders Day, they found a new colony or a new colony. And only a fraction of the total genetic diversity of the original gene pool is represented, right? The bottleneck effect. I want you to think about something getting smaller. This occurs when something like a natural disaster that kills a large portion of the population. So a large portion of those genetics are gone. Both results in severe reduction in the gene pool. So founder effect, I want you to think about the formation of an Amish settlement or something like that. Bottleneck effect, I want you to think about a natural disaster occurring. Just kind of word association, but both knowing that both of these result in severe reduction in the gene pool. Here I have a kind of slide illustrating that if you guys want to look at that. Same here. So gene flow, this is just the movement of alleles among populations when individuals or their gametes migrate from one population to another. So we could think about this, seeds going through pollination. The wind may carry these seeds and allow for cross-pollination to occur. Kind of self-explanatory. So non-random mating. So non-random mating is inbreeding. So inbreeding, obviously we know that doesn't occur as much as it used to, but inbreeding or mating between close relatives is an example of non-random mating. So random mating occurs due to selection of phenotype. We know that inbreeding results in a large portion of homozygous and recessive disorders, reduces the amount of heterozygous. Essentially, it's just cutting down the amount of diversity that's present. So I just need you to know that non-random mating is an example of inbreeding. Inbreeding is going to cause some disorders such as achromatopsia, which is just color blindness. Actually, your book gives an example of it occurring in the Pingelap area or an island. And then Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome. So just knowing non-random mating is an example of or inbreeding is an example of non-random mating. So non-random mating occurs when individuals are selective about choosing a mate with a preferred trait. Because most sexually reproducing organisms select their mates based on some trait, random mating is never observed in natural populations. Here's an example of inbreeding. So you have achromatopsia over here on the left, just seeing that everything is this black and white color blindness. And over here is Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome. It's just a form of dwarfism. So evolution by natural selection requires the following. You have to have individual variation. So the members have to differ. You have to have inheritance. It has to be able to be passed on between populations. You have to have overproduction. So there has to be a struggle for existence, right? Just like we said earlier about the elephants. Let's say that we had 19 million elephants, right? There would be overcrowding. You would have a food shortage. So only the strong are going to survive. You have to have differential reproductive success, just meaning that some individuals are able to adapt and they're going to continue to produce fertile offspring better than the next generation. So natural selection, stabilizing selection. This is important. This will be on your slide, or this will be on your exam. This favors an intermediate phenotype. So I give the example here of a baby's birth weight. So babies are typically born between 7 to 8 pounds, usually 6 to 8 sometimes. So birth favors an intermediate phenotype. What happens whenever you have a large baby, like a 13 or 14 pound baby? That's called large for gestational age. You often have a complicated delivery. You can have something called shoulder dystocia whenever the arm dislocates from the baby during a difficult delivery. Or you can have ergo chain palsy when you can have tearing of the brachial plexus, which are the nerves that run through your arm. So a large phenotype is not really preferred. So is a small phenotype preferred? Well, no, because babies' organs don't form as well as they possibly could, given more time or more weight. So just knowing that stabilizing selection favors an intermediate phenotype, and knowing that directional favors the extreme phenotype. Knowing those two terms. So macroevolution, we're not going to really spend much time on. This is just the origin of new species or speciation. There's different mechanisms that I'll let you guys read on, the prezygotic versus postzygotic. Um, Here is prezygotic, and you have habitat isolation, temporal isolation. These are just things that are going to occur before conception of the organism. Um, uh, So, adaptive radiation was a term that was used by Darwin. This was what he observed with the finch population. The evolution of several species of finches on the Galapagos Islands is an example of speciation caused by adaptive radiation. Knowing that punctuated equilibrium is long periods of no change, interrupted by periods of rapid decline. Two different models that your book talks about. So, really, the highlights, just going over punctuated equilibrium, knowing that this differs from the gradualistic model. The gradualistic model is exactly like the word implies, it's going to be more slow and steady change over time versus the punctuated equilibrium, which is going to be more punctual. It's going to be long periods of no change, interrupted by rapid periods of decline. Stabilizing selection, knowing that it favors an intermediate phenotype, is important. I give the example of the baby's birth weight. Knowing directional favors the extreme. Knowing that inbreeding is an example of non random mating. And again, that's going to give you more homozygous disorders. Um, Knowing that gene flow is the movement of alleles among populations when individuals or their gametes migrate. So when you think of gene flow, think of migration. Knowing the founder effect and the bottleneck effect, knowing that the founder effect is going to be whenever the formation of a new colony. So founder founding something or forming something, forming a new colony. The bottleneck effect is going to occur whenever things are starting from the end of the bottle, getting to a smaller portion of the bottle. So it's kind of what explains that. You start at large and it's getting smaller, 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 smaller. So you can think that the original population was here. Here was the bottlenecking event. Here's the surviving population. So think of something like a natural disaster. You had 100 people within the town. Natural disaster occurs, and then only 10 survive. Genetic drift, knowing that this is just due to a random meeting of gametes during fertilization. Knowing that mutations are the only source of variation in a population. If you don't have mutations, you have no change. Knowing the five principles of the Hardy-Weinberg. What does Hardy-Weinberg imply? Exactly, we're in a non-evolving state. It's a genetic equilibrium, right? So no mutations, no genetic drift, no gene flow, random mating, no selection. Glossopteris, example of continental drift. Glossopteris was a seed or a fern that was found in Antarctica. It's also found other places, so let us know that Antarctica wasn't that cold at one point. Know the definition of biogeography. Study the range and distribution of plants and animals in different places throughout the world. This is an example of anatomical evidence. These are homologous structures showing the same anatomical distribution of the different vertebrae, the vertebrae forelimbs. They're in the same type of structure, but remember, they have dissimilar functions. Knowing that vestigial structures are remnants, these are anatomical features that are fully developed, but essentially they have reduced or no function at all. Remember, we used the example of the ostrich and the bird. Birds are able to still fly, but ostriches have reduced flight ability or no flight at all. Um, Evolution is due to homologous structures, not analogous. Transitional links, note the Archaeopteryx, remember this fancy $100 word? It's an intermediate form, right? Archaeopteryx is an intermediate form. It was the transitional link between a dinosaur and a bird. Fossil records are formations of sedimentary rock that show the evolution between the layer that's found on the bottom, the oldest, between the layer that's found on top, the newest. Darwin observed finches in the Galapagos, right? Thank you guys.